Well, it's my very first day ever in Fresno. Happy to be here. Thank you all for coming to hear this. I'm going to talk about basically the war on drugs, why we need to end it, how we're trying to end it. I'm going to talk faster and faster, just because I got a lot to say and because I'm from New York and we do that. If it's too fast, somebody goes, slow down, okay? But before I get going, let me just get a read on all of you. Just show of hands. How many of you believe that the war on drugs has failed? Raise your hand. How many of you think we just haven't really tried our serious war on drugs, and if we did, we could actually succeed? Raise your hands. Okay, well, 2, good. 3, maybe 3. 4, maybe 4. Okay, 5. How many of you think that we should legalize marijuana? Raise your hands. How many think that we should keep marijuana illegal? Raise your hands. How many aren't sure? Raise your hands. Oh, okay. And how many of you think we should legalize all drugs? Raise your hands. How many of you think that's a bad idea? Raise your hands. How many aren't sure? Raise your hands. Okay. And how many of you have somebody very close to you who's had a problem with illegal drugs or alcohol? Raise your hands. Okay. How many of you have yourself or your friends or family who use illegal drugs but don't seem to have a problem? Raise your hands. How many of you don't know anybody who uses illegal drugs who doesn't have a problem? Raise your hands. Okay. And then these next set of questions, and how many of you, did I ask, have ever used marijuana? Raise your hands, please. How many of you have never used marijuana? How many of you don't want to say? Okay. And then if you could all just do me a favor, just close your eyes for a second. This is a confidential question. Close your eyes, close your eyes. How many of you have ever used a white powder drug like cocaine, MDMA, or anything else? Raise your hands. Close your eyes. How many of you have never used a white powder drug? Raise your hands. Okay, how many of you don't want to say? Actually, there was a big gap there. So, okay, I got an idea. So let me just say, so we're talking about a group here. It looks like actually maybe, if this is true, that how many of you, say it again, how many of you have never smoked marijuana? Raise your hands again, and never consumed it? Wow, I haven't talked to a group with that many people who have never smoked marijuana before in a while. Where have you been? I mean, okay, I'm not saying you should. I'm just saying, it's okay. But it's so here's what I do. So it sounds like many of you, marijuana not as popular here, but you are going to get a chance to vote on whether to legalize marijuana next year in California. And as Andy mentioned, I've been spending a lot of time, dealing with that over the last week as various drafts get, for the ballot and all this sort of stuff, and working with politicians and lawyers and activists and a whole range of others, people in the emergency industry. But what I want to talk is about the broader issue of ending the war on drugs, right? And I should just explain to you where I'm coming from on this. I used to be a professor. I've been an activist for decades, and before I was an activist professor. I believe deep down that the war on drugs is one of the most stupidest, most venal, most counterproductive policies almost ever designed in this country and around the world. I think that it has wreaked havoc in our country and many, many others in ways that people really mostly fail to realize, right? And then even as most people know it's not working and don't believe it can work, right, that we don't realize how bad it's ultimately been. I think part of what's kept us stuck in the war on drugs, part of it has been the prison industrial complex interests in the prison industry and others who want to keep this thing going because a lot of self-interest have developed around this. But I also think part of what keeps us stuck is our lack of understanding and knowledge about what are the realistic alternatives. One of the things I find is that even lots of people who agree with me that the drug war is terrible, we got to put fewer people in prison, we got to actually don't know that much about drugs per se, or don't know about the ways that other countries, other places deal with this stuff. And I think that's part of what's important to understand about this stuff. Ultimately, what I think we're trying to do here, one of my other fundamental views on this stuff is, right now, we make this fundamental divide between alcohol and tobacco on the one hand and these other drugs on the other hand, with the kind of pharmaceutical prescription drugs someplace in the middle, right? With these drugs, we say they're legal so long as you don't get drunk and drive a car. You know, you're not going to be a criminal, or get drunk and beat somebody up or kill somebody when you're not a criminal, right? If you just want to drink responsibly, or even if you want to drink irresponsibly, as long as you're not hurting anybody else or doing some violation of the law, that's okay, right? With smoking, right, bad idea, stupid idea, don't smoke. But as long as you're not lighting up in this room right here, and as long as you're just doing it out like in the park or whatever, you know, it's not a criminal matter, right? On the other hand, these other drugs, you know, you take methamphetamine, heroin, or cocaine, even possessing a tiny little bit just for yourself could be a felony conviction that could land you up in jail or state prison if you get caught a few times doing that stuff. Right? With marijuana, we're moving towards legalization now, right? We're not at the point in this state where it's actually taxed and regulated the way legal drugs are, but it's been decriminalized to the point where most people aren't going to jail anymore. But nonetheless, the business is dominated at the wholesale side, oftentimes by criminal organizations. And people are still getting killed in the trade, and people don't know what exactly they're buying a lot of times when they do this stuff, right? So we've made this divide that is sort of fundamentally problematic. Now, we think, well, let me ask you the question. If you ask, where did we make this divide? How many of you believe that 80, 90, 100 years ago, when we first criminalized, remember, because most of these drugs, marijuana, cocaine, even heroin, and other opiates were legal back in the 19th century, right? These drug laws don't go back to the Revolutionary War, they don't go back to the Civil War, they're really something that emerged in the late 19th, early 20th century. How many of you believe that a group of wise men, an early version of the National Academy of Sciences, which is our most responsible, got together 100 years ago and decide alcohol, tobacco, legal. These ones, illegal. Anyone believe that? So the question is, how and why do we make that divide? Right? How and why do we make the divide? And when you look at the history, and when you read deeply in the history, what you realize is that the decision to treat some drugs as legal and other drugs as illegal had almost nothing to do with the relative risks or dangers of those substances, and almost everything to do with who used and who was perceived to use those substances. You got it? That distinction is not based upon the relative dangers of these substances, it's based upon who was perceived to use these relative drugs. Okay? Now, anybody know who were the principal consumers of opiates? You know what opiates are? Opiates are heroin and morphine and Dilaudid and Demerol and synthetic opiates and codeine and all that sort of stuff. Who were the principal consumers of opiates back in the 1870s in America?
Chinese.
What?
Chinese.
Somebody said Chinese. Anybody have another answer? Somebody said white women. Middle-aged white women were the principal consumers. Right? Back in the 1870s, you could buy this stuff like in the mails. There was a liquid opium called laudanum that you could drink. Right? People used it for everything. I mean, opium and opiates were the best cure. There was no penicillin back then. There was no Motrin, right? Women going through their period, but nothing, right? Bad sanitation, and so people had diarrhea all the time. Nothing stops you like opiates, right? You know, the opiates, you're constipated, right? I mean, it was because nothing else existed. People relied on it for everything. Your baby was teething and crying. Wipe a little tiny bit of opium right in their gums. That was just commonly used all around the world for this sort of stuff, right? You know what? And you know something? Nobody thought about criminalizing it because nobody wanted to put their white auntie or grandma behind bars. But when, you said it, the Chinese started coming to this country, right? Working long hours on the railroads and the mines, 80, 90 hours a week, and then kicking back in their dormitories or their tents or whatever it might be, and smoking the opium pipe just the way they did in the old country for generations, just the way white people would kick back with some whiskeys or whatever it might be. That's when you got the first opium prohibition laws in California and Nevada in the late 1870s, 1880s, right? All about the fear of the Chinaman. The Chinaman with his opium dens, addicting and seducing and luring white women into turning them into sex slaves, opium-addicted sex slaves. That's what drove it. Look at the journalism in the day. You'll see that's what prompted the first opium prohibition laws. The first cocaine prohibition laws all about the fear of black men in the South in the first decade of the 20th century, taking this white powder up their noses, and who knows, them forgetting their proper place in decent society and going out there and God knows what they would do to our precious white women. First time a police department ever said we needed a 38 won't serve, we need a 45 because you can't shoot a Negro crazed on cocaine with a 38, only a 45 will bring him down. Right? I mean, this was the claims. The New York Times, the most official upstanding newspaper in America, they were printing this sort of stuff. You know, marijuana got illegal? All about prejudice against Mexican Americans and Mexican migrants in the teens and the 20s and early 30s in the western states in the Southwest, beginning in El Paso and parts of California, spreading to become state laws. Before we ever got federal prohibition in 37, right? It was all about those Mexicans and that funny smelling little reefer cigarette, la cucaracha, no puedo caminar sin su marijuana, right? I mean, all of this, it was that type of prejudice, okay? And quite frankly, even alcohol prohibition, you know what alcohol prohibition was to some very good extent about? It was about a conflict between the white Americans and the not-so-white Americans. Between the white Americans who came from Northern and Western Europe to the Americas in the late 18th, early 19th century, and the not-so-white Americans coming from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe in the late 19th and early 20th century and freaking all the good white people out the same way that people coming from Central America and Asia and Latin America are freaking people out today, right? And in that response, right, you had the emergence of Prohibition, that here you had these darker-skinned Europeans coming with their vino and their beer and their Schlivowitz, all these horrible traditions, right? And it wasn't that the white Americans weren't consuming alcohol as well, right? I mean, some of them went into all these temperance oaths and they went drinking all this sort of stuff. But by and large, the people who were more settled in the society knew that when you criminalize something, it's by and large not the kind of good people who are going to land up getting busted and targeted. It's those other people, the ones we're used to policing all the time, right? This has been a very hard lesson. Most times you deal with in the African American church, right? Very moralistic. And you see a lot of the same things going on in Latino Catholic Church, Latino Evangelical Church, right? I mean, the basic notion that drugs are evil, drugs are bad, drugs are terrible, destroying our community, therefore let's have criminal laws, cops, and police to go after that. And then, of course, who is it that the cops and the police go after? It's the people living in communities of color, poorer communities, and by and large, leaving alone the elites who are doing the same stuff in their corporate boardrooms, their political offices, their homes, or what have you. That's the fundamental divide. Understand that this drug war, now it drives me crazy when sometimes say, well, Ethan, Drug Policy Alliance, my organization, you want to change this, you want to allow needle exchange programs to reduce AIDS, you want to allow this to reduce overdose fatalities, you want to reduce the prison life, prove that your reform will work. And I'm asking, why is the burden on me to prove the reform will work when the law, the status quo that you are defending is grounded not in science, not in economics, not in any types of human rights analysis, not in anything. It's grounded in racial and ethnic and class prejudice.